Let's talk about coloring a comic page. My name is Matt Wilson. I've colored too many Marvel comics to list them all. Thor, Daredevil, and Scarlet Witch. I've been on Thor for forever. Every color is made up of three core components: hue, saturation, and value. And understanding these three components will help you immensely when coloring a comic. You'll find yourself sometimes stumped. Why can't I get this glow to look glowy? Or why is this green not popping? There's a lot of times you'll come up against a problem, and the only way to solve that is to understand these components that make up a color. Perhaps that glow's not glowing because every other color around your glow is too similar in value, or not a good enough contrast in saturations, things like that. So if you don't understand how the hue, saturation, and value of each color works, and then how each component of a color works against another color's three components, you're gonna just be left guessing, and then that'll make you spend more and more time trying to fix a problem when you could, with the understanding of these components, kind of solve problems much quicker, get on to the next page, which is important when you have 20 pages to color. Let's start with hue. Essentially, hue is the name of a color. If you looked at a color wheel and you said there's red, green, yellow, blue, that's the hue. Silly little drawing of balloons, that's a red balloon, a blue balloon, a yellow balloon. Those are all referring to the hue. Next up, we'll talk about saturation. Essentially, saturation refers to the intensity of a color or the richness of a color. The more saturated, the more pure the color appears. The less saturated, the more washed out or kind of pale a color will appear. Here in the middle, again, we have red, most saturated red at the top, kind of becoming less and less saturated all the way down to where it just turns into a gray at the bottom. And then again, my examples of being both those items are yellow. The lemon is a much more saturated yellow. That lovely cheese wedge is a less saturated yellow. And then we'll move on to value after that. That's the relative darkness or lightness of a color. Value exists separately from hue and saturation. So for example, if you're looking at a black and white photograph, that's a photograph of objects that are colored, but all you are seeing are those colors' values. So another way to think of value can easily be thought of as a 10-point scale, 0 to 10, 0 being white, 10 being black. Every number in between would be a gray, going from lighter to darker. And here again, value in my drawings, those are all red, but in different values, from darker to middle to light. That's just a quick overview of hue, saturation, and value. Every color is made up of those three things, and it's just good to have at least some understanding of that, or you'll find yourself just kind of grasping at straws when you run into a problem on a page. All right, so we'll pull up this page of Eternals, and also in Photoshop, kind of pull up the hue, saturation, lightness sliders, which deal with everything we're talking about here. And just to show of some of these things in action, you can see most of this is blue, but if I grab the hue slider, it's going to change the colors to green, yellow, orange, so on and so forth. Saturation, I'd say this is already a somewhat saturated image, at least in parts, but you can see if I pull this down, it gets less and less saturated or more and more desaturated until it essentially becomes a black and white image with lots of grayscale, gray tones in it. And then lightness in this particular menu, that would refer to the value of the colors. To the right here is lighter, till it's basically washed out all the colors to white. And then the opposite's true by going the other way. I will often kind of cordon off certain sections of the page, the far background or the, extreme foreground or something in the midground, and just make it more or less saturated, just those parts to push it further from your eye, closer to your eye. You'll see a lot of saturation in these kind of far off background areas, which might be counterintuitive to what a lot of people, saturation comes forward, usually desaturation goes backwards. But in this case, I'm just using contrasts of saturated versus desaturated. And that contrast in and of itself helps push and pull the space. And then in combination with the contrast in values, higher and lighter values, all of that's all working together to bring the focus onto the main character here. But the point being, even though those backgrounds are more saturated, that saturation is isolated only to those areas. So that's an example of knowing this middle ground section that's receding towards the background been just as saturated as the background, well then that middle ground and background would have flattened out and read as the same plane. As it is now, my middle ground stuff is kind of darker and less saturated. Then my furthest background stuff is a little lighter and more saturated. So those two things work in contrast with each other and help push the space. And then again, the extreme foreground elements, their value is much higher than all of the rest of that. So now it stands alone as a third and even closer element. Within those three things, hue, saturation, value, kind of let's talk about the importance of understanding each one of them. So for example, in hue, a good thing to understand would be color schemes. There's a lot more than this. There's other words for some of these, but here are a few basics, and I'm going to show some examples. All right, so let's start on the top left in this image. So monochromatic, you can see that all the colors were going to fall within a single hue, and what you're going to change to get your contrast and stuff is either the value or saturation within that single hue. It's essentially all within that family of blues, and I've just increased or decreased the saturations or increased or decreased the values from lighter to darker. Go to the right here for complementary. This is a good example of a complementary color scheme. If we go back and look at the color wheel, you can see that green is opposite of red on the color wheel, and that's what we mean by complementary color. Here on my example here, I've got blue directly across from orange, which is another set of complementary colors. But in this case, for these Hulk pages, I believe a crazy big gamma radiation bomb has gone off, which is associated with Hulk, which is associated with green. So I've decided to lean into what would otherwise be a monochromatic green color scheme, except for as Iron Man ejects himself out of this big giant robot, I decided to introduce a complementary color just to show kind of the contrast between what had just happened outside with the big gamma bomb and then Tony Stark's tech, you know, inside the robot he ejected himself from, and then in his red little face mask on his spacesuit or whatever he's in here. So this is an example of using a complementary color scheme. So next we'll move to analogous color scheme. It's essentially a color and then the two colors on either side of it on the color wheel. This is a good example of an analogous color scheme. It all kind of lives on that side of the color wheel with the blues and the greens, with the exception obviously of Cap's shield, which, you know, there's some things you just can't get around. There was no way I was going to make Cap's shield or Thor's cape green or something in this scene just to fit in. But overall, the majority of this page lives within that analogous color scheme. And that's why this palette works and is harmonious. Anything that's like analogous or monochromatic that is restricted to one side or sometimes just one color in the color wheel is less chaotic. In this case, my intentions were to keep the focus strictly on the characters, keeping the backgrounds in that analogous color scheme, let those recede, and then the yellows and reds on Cap and Thor could step forward off of that and just the focus on their dialogue. Okay, triadic. Now this is a triadic color scheme using what's called the secondary colors, green, purple, and orange. This one is a little looser in the sense that it's not like three different monochromatic areas. The dominating colors overall are purple, orange, and green, with the foliage, with the space, and then with the exploding planet at the bottom. So sometimes, like in a monochromatic palette, the end result is very literal. I mean, it's monochromatic. There are just only blues in there. And then sometimes it's a little more loose. It's a little bit more of just a suggestion. Yes, there are other colors besides the three that are listed in that scheme. All these colors will work well together because the majority of these colors live within that triadic color scheme. And this is a good way to create dynamic scenes with colors from disparate parts of the color wheel, but that are still unified and pleasing to the eye as opposed to just random and wild and, you know, kind of disjointed and hard to look at. You'll see like split complementary, and basically that just, you take one color, in this case red, and then the other two colors live on either side of its complement. So on either side of green in this case. And we'll see that kind of in practice here on this Captain America page. And I think red had been established for a lot of this villain's imagery. So I already knew I had a lot of red elements, so I was looking for some other colors to nicely complement it. And then I kind of made Cap's blue a little more teal, and then I used a lot of green there in the background. And so that just makes for a, you know, an eye-pleasing, kind of harmonious palette overall. But again, like, you know, their skin tones are kind of dip into the purples here and there, and so does his collar. So it's not like every color has to be within the three colors set up, but it's more just of a general rule to apply to the page overall to help kind of bring everything in line. This tetradic one is not something that gets used a whole lot, at least by me. It's similar to analogous in that, like, you're kind of giving yourself a little wiggle room on either side of a dominant color, but then also finding some contrast by doing the same thing on the opposite side of the color wheel. You'll see colors other than that in here, but the majority of them live in that blue and purple or yellow and orange kind of area. The sets of colors you're using being on the opposite side of the color wheel make the image a little more dynamic. It's good for action scenes, that kind of thing. And then sometimes you'll see something in a page that, like Icarus shooting Thanos with his eye beams, like is naturally going to give you these oranges and yellows. And so you know, well, that element is in the page, it's there. You're going to make it those colors. Well, now what other colors can I use everywhere else? And that's a lot of how the decision-making process goes for me, is what elements are already set in stone and they're, you know, I'm being told to use essentially by the art. Those need to be this color. Well, what will work well around those, behind those, before those, after those, places to give contrast and impact. It's probably 70-30. 70% of the time it's organic. 30% of the time it's, you know, oh, I see the color scheme in this, I'm going to use the color scheme. Within all of that, it's also important, you know, having some intent to begin with is useful because it gives you a direction. And all of these color schemes are schemes that we as humans kind of naturally react to in various ways. So kind of understanding those and knowing when to implement them is a good tool to have in your bag as a colorist.
Anybody can learn how to make comics, but if you want to learn from Marvel pros, check out the rest of the course at proko.com/Marvel. We have more free lessons that will help you on your journey and let you peek into the course to decide if it's right for you. Once you go premium, we'll teach you scripting, drawing and inking techniques, how to make environments, comic covers, and more. There's so much to learn if you want to make good comics, and this course will set you on your path to make your own.